Hey, welcome to Modern Day Debate. Very excited to be here. We are doing a live stream debate on Christianity versus agnosticism. The first time we've ever done this specific type of debate, because we have had Christianity more so towards atheism in the positive sense or scholarly sense of the definition, but to have agnosticism is a new creature. So we are very excited to get the ball rolling. So with that, I'm just going to give both of the debaters just a chance to share about what's going on at their channels, maybe what their goals are in case they don't have a channel. Then if you have a website or organization, that's going to be linked in the description. And if you just want to share about what you've been up to at your, whether it be Twitter or your website, we would love to hear it. And we want to say thank you, both of you debaters, for being here tonight.
Thanks, James. I guess I'll start. My name is Matt Mitchell. I run ApoloJedi.com, and I hope to get from this debate just a chance to share the love of Jesus and the proof that he is for sure the creator.
You bet. Well, we're stoked to have you here. And Joseph, if you want to share as well, we're stoked to have you here as well. Thanks for coming.
Oh, yeah. My name's Joseph Sakovac. I'm not a content creator yet. I'm thinking about maybe getting into that in a few months. I'm mainly just here for the arguments, as I'm a science student and I love to hear other people's opinions on various things. And I decided to pick up epistemology, not necessarily become heavy into philosophy, but I'm interested in this whole supernatural versus methodological naturalism debate. And I'm more of an agnostic, so I love hearing both sides, but I like putting myself in a position where I have other people try to make their points, and I try to see if I can't poke holes in the arguments.
You bet. Well, we're excited to have this discussion tonight. So with that, we are just going to have roughly 5 to 8 minute introductory statements from each side. And then we are actually going to go into just an open discussion. Most people prefer the open discussion, so that's what we're doing. Generally speaking, it's, you could say, a hybrid format. So with that, we're going to just start the clock at, like I said, 8 minutes. And the debaters, of course, don't have to use the full amount of time. That they're welcome to if they want. So we can start with ApoloJedi, given that we usually start with the affirmative. So ApoloJedi, again, thanks for coming on. First time here, and we're glad to have you. And I will start the timer on your first word.
Thanks, James. I appreciate you hosting the debate. Joseph, thank you also for inviting me to be part of this debate tonight. I just want to have a few quick disclaimers just because of the thought police. So my involvement in this debate, I'm in no way representing any past, present, or future employer or any specific religious denominations. I intend and hope to be a faithful representative of Jesus, the promised Messiah, who is worthy of all praise. As you can see, the camera is pointed to my bad side, but this is the arrangement of my monitors, so we're just going to have to deal with the cards that were dealt. So again, thank you guys. I don't want to misrepresent Joseph at all. As we were talking in our discussions about how we wanted to format the debate, the question came up, does Christianity or naturalism better account for reality? And so now I find he wants to be more identified perhaps as an agnostic, but methodological naturalism fits very well with the thoughts I have prepared. So I'm going to go with methodological naturalism. And the question we have to ask is, does Christianity or naturalism better account for reality? And let's start with some definitions. So reality, as I looked up online, the state of things as they actually exist. And I think that's a fair definition. To account for, to provide a satisfactory explanation or reason for. Christianity, this is again Google's definition, the worldview based on the teachings and prophetic fulfillments of Jesus Christ. That'll work. It's much deeper than that, but we're going to go with that for tonight. And naturalism, the worldview that everything arises from natural causes. Supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded. So I'm going with those definitions. If we need to adjust those or change those as we go on, Joseph, feel free to put in your own input as you see fit. So providing the necessary and satisfactory explanation for reality, to me, comes down to 8 things I've identified to help us in our thoughts. So for either Christianity or naturalism to satisfactorily explain reality, there has to be, number one, a source or origin for matter. Number two, a source or origin for truth. Three, a source or origin for the laws of logic. Four, a source for unchanging physical laws, sometimes called the uniformity of nature, the reason why nature tends to run based on specific natural laws. Number five, morality, a source or an origin for morality. Number six, the source or origin for generally reliable senses. As humans, we have senses, and for them to be generally reliable, we ought to expect there to be a satisfactory explanation for their source, why we would expect them to be generally reliable. Number seven, a source for human consciousness. And number eight, why do we expect a human to have the ability to comprehend matter, truth, physical laws, morality, all the things that we discussed in points 1 through 7. So I want to make a positive case real quick about Christianity. Number one, Christianity reveals that through God's word, God revealed, and that's how we know things. The Creator revealed that He is the creator of matter. Number two, as far as a source for truth, God claims to be the source for truth in Isaiah 45:19. God very clearly claims to be that source. Number three, as far as the laws of logic, laws of logic, as we think about what they are unchanging, they are not made of matter, and they're universal. The Creator is unchanging. He's unbound by space and time. He can provide a necessary foundation for logic. He claims in several places, if we think about the law of identity, Exodus 3:14 talks about God being who He is. He identifies Himself. The law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, all these things are grounded by who the Creator is. So that's the third one. The fourth one, the physical laws. The Creator, God, claims to be the originator, the writer of these physical laws. Think of, let's see here, I have it written down somewhere. Strong force, weak force, magnetism, radiation, entropy, these things that are absolute and abstract are universal laws that that govern the universe. The fifth thing, the Creator has revealed His character to be the source of unchanging morality. His morality is what guides us. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. There's a source for morality there. Number six, because God created mankind for the purpose of using our senses to honor Him, we have generally reliable senses. Now, that does take into account also that after the fall, our senses became less reliable. So I don't think they are necessarily the perfect source for all knowledge, because what I can hold on to is that the Creator revealed Himself to be that source. Number seven, consciousness makes sense for Christians because the Creator imparted His image to mankind. So in the Christian worldview, we can account for that. And number eight, because humanity was created in God's image, it would be expected that humans would be able to comprehend matter, truth, physical laws, and morality. Now, there's some obstacles for naturalism. These 8 things, I'd like to hear how they can account for, from a methodological naturalism, for those things, as well as several things we see in science, like the faint young sun paradox, the Fermi paradox, out-of-place artifacts, the first star paradox, and we may even be able to get this far, the problem of evil. So that's about 7 minutes worth of talking there. I will yield the balance of my time to Joseph and let him make his opening statement. Then we can have some open discussion. Thank you.
You bet. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that articulate opening statement. So with that, we will now move on to Joseph Joseph's opening statement. And so, as mentioned, if you want to end early, as Matthew did, then we can also basically just have you end early. You can donate the time to Q&A. So, Joseph, the floor is yours. I will start the clock on your first word.
All right. From a methodological naturalistic standpoint, I believe we can account for almost everything, but not quite everything. The idea of the first cause, I don't know if we necessarily can make that assertion, because it is currently unknown exactly how the universe got started to begin with. We do know from obvious evidence that it is expanding and that it probably at one point was in some sort of singularity. And not to go outside of my depth of knowledge here because I'm kind of new to physics, but there is several ideas postulated that say that gravity, because of the nature of it, we could be living in a universe that didn't necessarily have to have a first cause. You know, the idea that the the sum total of energy is basically zero based on the geometry of the universe. I'm not quite sure about the math on that, so take that with a grain of salt. As for consciousness, I think that can be defined as your brain, and I think neuroscientists have done a pretty good job. Again, way outside of my field of expertise, but they've done a pretty good job of ascribing everything that we think, feel, and think about, and they've pretty much been able to isolate that to different portions of the brain. So I'll go with that. What else? Argument for morality. I don't know if we'll get into that or not today, because that would go into the Bible, which I'm definitely not much of an expert on it, but I do recall in the Bible God changing his mind a few times, getting convinced out of something he was convinced of, endorsing slavery, but that's just a nasty debate in and of itself. The whole reason I got involved in this debate was because of a post while I was looking for some math facts that my opponent made a claim that because the odds of the universe existing as is for life to come about were astronomically low, and therefore, I'm not trying to misrepresent him, but he basically was trying to say it was near impossible. And I got into it because I'm of the mindset that just because something is very improbable doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that it's equally improbable as all other possibilities. And I think that's pretty much all the points I'm really overtly interested in talking about. So I'll yield the rest of my time.
You bet. So very excited to move into open discussion. And so this is, as most people usually prefer, I'm just going to let this be organic and go where the debaters take it. So very excited to have you guys go. And I'll start the clock for, I think we decided on 45 minutes. So just to keep us on track so we can jump into the Q&A. So those of you who have questions, feel free to just shoot a modern day debate at the start of your comment in the comments section, or I should say your question that you punch into the comments section. That just lets me know the questions for one of the speakers. And also, if you're new here for the first time, stoked to have you. Hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot of debates. Hopefully we'll get to have these debaters back, as I'm already excited about just how I think clear and articulate both have been. So the floor is yours, gentlemen. Oh, I think we're, let's see.
I was on mute.
Okay.
I tried to not be having sounds while Joseph was talking, so I muted my microphone. So can you hear me now? We're good?
Yep, we're good.
I know Joseph had wanted to talk about the math and the specific claim that I made on my ApoloJedi.com post. And we got into it a little bit on Twitter, but that seemed to be insufficient for where we were going. So I guess I'll start out with, Joseph, you claim to be a math student, and you agree that math is immaterial. It's not made of matter. It's an abstract process, thought.
It's more or less, it's a pretty good way of describing and predicting the nature of reality. Because if you think about it, our quantum mechanics that we have started out as I can't remember the phrasing, but one of the professors that was alive around that time just thought it was a math trick, and then it turned out it works pretty well. It's been the most successful theory we've had so far. In fact, I'm kind of excited to get into that class here in a year or two. But I don't agree that it's necessarily completely abstract. I think it relates to reality. It's just that it doesn't always work like that in ways that are immediately obvious until somebody discovers something years down the line. So I'd say that math is more or less descriptive of reality, if that makes any sense.
It doesn't explain the source or origin of math. I would propose that math is unchanging. It is immaterial and it's universal. It's the same everywhere, whether you do math on Mars or Alpha Centauri on Earth, math doesn't change. And so if the universe, as we know it, is constantly changing, it's in a constant state of flux, and is only made of matter, for the methodological naturalist, how do you account for the origin of mathematics? Before we can use it, I think you need to at least justify that it's feasible from within your worldview.
I think it's just something man-made for the most part. It just describes what is already there. And I know where you're getting. I know where you're getting. Where did the matter come from? That's a problem that I think is an issue in both science and religion, because if you really want to break it down to the to ad infinitum, you could ask questions like, where did God come from, or whatever. But there are some pretty good examples of virtual particles in space-time appearing to come out of nothing. I would love to be able to explain that better. I unfortunately can't yet. But all math is really doing is it's something that we made. It's just something that is describing what we're seeing, if that makes any sense. It doesn't really have an origin outside of people.
Well, I would disagree that humans created mathematics. Now, definitely, they have been able to discover how new numbers relate to each other, and have been able to formulate the way that math behaves so that it can be taught and learned and make it useful. But I think the burden of proof would be on you to say that that mankind made it or invented it.
As I recall, algebra, or at least a primal form of it, was invented near Baghdad by a person trying to explain. I can't remember what he was trying to explain. I'm not much of a math historian. And the basis of trigonometry was created sometime in the area of Greece. And eventually we had to come together as a society to figure out how stuff like the stars moved. So Isaac Newton discovered calculus, and that's not always perfect. It's just descriptive. And
I agree with you that he discovered calculus. He discovered the way that mathematics behaves and was able to formulate it so that it could be taught and it could be learned. But I don't think he's not the inventor. He didn't create the number 0. Nobody created the number 2. Nobody created 2 + 2 is 4. The arithmetic, those things are the way that mathematics behaves. It's a universal law. So I guess I could ask you, if you believe that there was a time prior to mankind, did mathematics exist? Did the universe obey the mathematical laws prior to Newton formulating the ideas of calculus and the laws of motion?
For the most part, yes, but I would say that the laws are more descriptive, not really prescriptive, if that makes sense. I don't believe that you had to have a creator of these concepts for them to exist. Well, I mean, in a metaphysical sense, you don't really need it. I believe you can account for just about anything without invoking a god. Whether or not he exists is a totally different issue.
Well, I'd like to hear your satisfactory explanation. That's kind of what we're talking about. I think if I were to just say that that's just descriptive rather than prescriptive and left it at that, that would be unsatisfactorily for you to hear from me as my answer, I'm guessing. So it's unsatisfactory for me to hear, well, it's just the way it is. That's just how math is just there. So I don't understand how, in a universe that is in a constant state of flux and is made only of matter, how we get these abstract, unchanging laws that seem to govern the way the universe works. And you could throw in all the natural laws in there: gravity, strong force, weak force, magnetism, all those things, radiation. Those things all seem to be natural forces that, for the most part, are unchanging. I know there are constants that are unchanging, and there are variables within radiation that can cause it to radiate at different ways. But for the most part, we see these universal laws are unchanging, and that's unexpected in the methodological naturalism's worldview of where they come from.
I think it could have been. I think it could have been any number of ways, and we just so happen to exist in a universe where it came about the way it did. And if you believe anything about M theory or string theory, there could maybe, I'm not saying it's possible, but maybe possible that there's other universes where the laws of the universe did work out different. And bringing it down to an evolutionary perspective, not really my field, but it's something that I think you were interested in knowing an answer to, that it was, even if the conditions on Earth developed differently, we could have possibly maybe had life, but it wouldn't have developed into what we know now. And we wouldn't have been alive to, quote unquote, invent math to really understand the universe. So basically, it is the way it is sometimes as good as you can get as far as why the laws of the universe seem to work the way they do.
All
And
right.
as for matter being the only thing in the universe, for the most part, I'd say we're right, but I wouldn't assert that, even though I am in physics, because you never know what's out there.
You never know what's out there. That is probably true. There's a lot of things we haven't seen, but that's unsatisfactory as an explanation to ground methodological naturalism. I'm okay to move on if you want to move on or ask some specific questions. I started with the question. If you have something.
Why do you think it's impossible that evolution happened? Is that your position, for one thing, and why do you believe it if it is?
So if we want to get into specific definitions, how would you define evolution to make sure? Because sometimes we get a bait and switch on it's just change over time, or perhaps the grand theory of evolution, which explains all of life.
Especially since it's not in my field anymore, because I'm no longer a biochemistry major. I would like to stick with the idea of change over time, and it's basically the law of biodiversity, not the law of abiogenesis, not the laws governing star formation or anything like that. Just,
sorry, go ahead. I believe in change over time. There's nothing. I think the things we see happening around us, change happens. So if that's the definition of evolution, then that's what I believe in. If we want to talk about the grand theory of evolution, that from a single common ancestor acting on random mutations with natural selection over billions of years, that is not demonstrable. So it's outside of science. It is a philosophical assumption. And what we actually observe is things devolving.
I've seen a phylogeneticist talk about how we have fossils linking dogs and bears together and whatnot. And I do believe a lot of the scientists working on different genome projects that we are descended from common ancestors. Now, how far back that goes, no one knows, but there's clear evidence of speciation over time. And you even have Homo erectus and other things that arrived before us. So I would say that the theory of evolution's pretty sound, and it's been demonstrated for at least the last 50 to 100 years. I'm not sure how far back it goes. Not much of a historian. But I know you don't really like the guy from what we tweeted, but Aaron Ra does a pretty good series on it if you ignore some of the attitude he sometimes has. But he goes into great detail about the fossil record and a little bit of the genetic stuff that I am not quite privy to. but he does a pretty good job of explaining how the theory of evolution was established.
Well, if we could go into perhaps the nature of evidence, I would love to get into that. To actually evaluate evidence, I think several things have to be in place. To evaluate evidence, you have to have a foundation for truth, to be able to know what is true, what is false. So you'd have to have a truth anchor, which is one of the things I talked about in, it was number 2 in my opening statement. So we have to have a truth anchor to know whether something is right or wrong, not necessarily in a moral sense, but true or false. You have to have laws of logic to be able to evaluate evidence. So if something is, you have to compare it to that truth anchor. You have to be able to account for those laws of logic. Those are 2 things that are necessary that I don't think methodological naturalism can account for. The third thing is that within your worldview, everyone interprets evidence based on their worldview. So from a Christian worldview, I see the same evidence. There's not any special secret evolutionary evidence that Christians are unaware of, and that's the gotcha that comes out in debates, because we all see the same evidence. I'm fully aware of dinosaurs. I'm fully aware of carbon dating, radiometric dating, genetic information, information theory, the fossils. All those things are all easily explainable within a Christian worldview. But I have a foundation. I have a truth anchor. I have a foundation for the laws of logic. I have a foundation that can explain these fossils, Homo erectus. I've read the book I've got here. You mentioned that one specifically, Bones of Contention, Marvin Lubino. Great. I highly recommend this book. If you haven't read it, it gives great insight into fossils and why they do not explain that it's totally against the evolutionary worldview as being taught in schools these days. So I guess my question would be, since we're just dialoguing,
you mind if I ask the credentials of the guy who wrote the book? Not to nitpick, I'm just curious.
He is. I'm not big on credentials. I'm going to go ahead and give you his credentials because he has them. But I'd ask the same question of Charles Darwin. Do you know what his credentials were? He was a theologist. He had no credentials to be able to create philosophical ideas that persist to this age.
His arguments were pretty good, though.
Fair enough. And if whether Dr. Lubino is a paleontologist as he claims or not, you need to address his arguments rather than his credentials. The same with me. I have no credentials. I'm a regular guy. I like to read and like to study, but I don't think it.
I'm of the belief that any layman can be correct. I just wanted to be sure so I could see if I could find any of his work.
Sure, and I'll look that up when you get a chance to talk. But maybe while you're talking, you could answer this question. So, what is the truth anchor for the methodological naturalist? Something that is unchanging, that is abstract. Your source for truth, as well as your source for the laws of logic. How do they make sense for, or what is their source?
The source of the laws of logic? That's an interesting question. I believe logic more or less evolved as we learned to survive. I don't think there's anything particularly magical to it. Over time, we had to figure out what would kill us, what wouldn't, and we had to find a method of evaluating what is quote-unquote true and not true. And I don't believe that religion is how we figured out a lot of the technological advances or anything like that. But that's besides the point. But as for my grounding in truth, I don't think that it's necessarily possible to find an absolute truth, especially through science. I think the only assumptions we can make is that we all experience relatively similar reality, and we can make a hypothesis and test it until it becomes theory, and then we can form a worldview from that. So I don't really think it had a supernatural source, and if it did, it did. I'm not too concerned about it.
So as we were talking, I did find that Dr. Lubino has been a paleontologist for more than 35 years, and he wrote this book probably back in 2005. when it was printed.
Okay.
So you talked
If you
about.
want,
Oh, go ahead.
if you want, you can send that to my email as well after this, just so I can kind of take a look.
Sure, love to. So you talked about perhaps the way that laws of logic came about, that perhaps they came about in an evolutionary mechanism. Of course, that's and if I misrepresent, feel free to interrupt. I don't want to
Okay.
misrepresent you, but it sounded like what you were saying was that the laws of logic came about similar to the way that life progressed through evolution, that over time you got more and better laws of logic. Is that
It's possible,
what
and
you're
we might.
saying?
Yeah, it's possible, and I think that we might even find a better way to do things eventually too. Who knows?
So if laws of logic are not truly laws, but hypothesis, pragmatic hypotheses based on what works, you're of the opinion that laws of logic could change in the future, or perhaps were in the past, that the proto laws of logic were not truly laws? Is that what you're claiming?
It depends. I mean, I don't really know if anything was around to really contemplate it back then. How we view things could change dramatically in the next however long we're alive. But what I'm saying is this is what we have, and we have a reality to rely upon to get our quote-unquote truth. Beyond that, it's kind of guesswork.
Well, we do have reality, but what we're trying to discuss in this conversation is which worldview best accounts for and has an explanatory power for the source for these things. And what I'm hearing from you is that laws of logic aren't truly laws. It's some sort of pragmatic hypothesis that over time changes. And to me, that doesn't make sense, because if there was a law of logic that was just a hypothesis a billion years ago when some animal was trying to determine it to be true, it couldn't be preserved via evolution, because evolution is claims only to be able to preserve what causes fitness, not what is true or what is right.
Well, think of it this way. If a creature could not logically deduce whether something was harmful or not, they would probably just die with the way the universe, not the way the Earth has been. So I'm thinking we developed logic as a necessary mechanism of survival, because if A leads to B and we think that it doesn't, or if we think A perhaps leads to C, then that could be a problem if A indeed leads to B instead of to C, if that makes sense. So we developed logic over time to combat, how do I say it best? I'm not really a philosopher. Okay, say your ancestor saw a bunch of berries, right? A few of them eat it and then they die. And then somebody says, oh, that's a little strange. I think I'll avoid those berries now, right? Okay, the one who avoids those poison berries lives on to pass on his genes, and the ones that don't obviously die off, right? So that could potentially account for some of the laws of logic. Not necessarily the laws, but how we perceive them, if that makes sense.
So what it sounded like you're saying is that the creatures that didn't eat the berries already had the laws of logic. They would have to evaluate something with logic that pre-existed. So you have to make it work in your worldview, you have to assume it was always there for some proto creature to be able to utilize it.
Possibly.
I don't want to get bogged down in that. It makes, I think I've made the case that it makes more sense that it is the thinking of God. But you've
Then
made
you
your
would
case
have
as
to,
well.
if you did that, then you would have to prove how a God existed, and that's a lot harder than people like to make it out to be. That would be really difficult though. But if you want to try to do that to prove the laws of logic, I'd be happy to hear your arguments.
For the existence of God?
Not just for his existence, but how it could be possible would be a good place to start.
Well, So I guess I want to hear your question, and I'll try to answer your question.
If we're going to go with your assumption that the laws of logic are created by a god, then we would have to confirm that said god existed, and then we would have to confirm that he could not have had a cause as well, or maybe he did have a cause. Yeah, that would be a good argument. So how can you present the possibility of God's existence?
Well, it's very easy for the Christian. God revealed himself.
Yes, but how would you do that for somebody who isn't a Christian, though?
God revealed himself to everyone. We all know that God exists.
What about the tribes that don't have a concept of God?
They know that God exists.
But they don't have a concept of him?
Just by the very nature of God, the way he revealed himself through creation. Now that a tribe that may never have seen the written word of God, that is part of God's revelation, and through Jesus, he's revealed himself those three ways. They are still accountable to the God because of what he has revealed. In his word, he says that everyone knows and everyone is without excuse. So,
well, that's nice, but they don't seem to know what a God is. So even if they are accountable, how do you explain them not knowing what a God is? That's just something that I find interesting.
thankfully, I'm not the judge, and I don't have to judge them for that. But
Well,
because God revealed himself as that judge, he gets to be the one who judges what they know and what they don't know. And he says in his word, he revealed in his word that everyone knows that there is a God.
We're done with that. Okay. So even if everybody knew supposedly that there was a God, that still doesn't do much to prove how he could possibly exist then.
Well, because everyone knows, then everyone knows he exists. What kind of proof are you looking for?
Okay, how about this? This might be a little easier. Do you believe God affects reality? Like in a measurable way in some way?
He claims to. He claims to hold reality together in Colossians 2. By him all things consist.
How do you think he affects reality in such a way that we could detect? Because even if he was supernatural, I would think that he would be able to affect reality in such a way that we could see that something was there that wasn't there before, if that makes any sense. So that would be a really good indicator to me of God's existence. I would drop my agnosticism really quickly if I actually saw him physically affect reality in a way that is peer-reviewed, because that would be something else. I don't really think there's a grand conspiracy to cover it up or anything. I think any scientist would jump at the opportunity to prove such a phenomenon.
Let me answer it in a couple of different ways. It is a category error, by the way, for someone to want natural evidence of the supernatural.
But I just told you that if he affected the natural, then it would leave some sort of imprint that would have been pretty obvious that it couldn't have happened within just nature. It would be demonstrable that it was God, or not necessarily even just God, just the supernatural in general.
From my worldview, that makes sense. All of creation is evidence for God. From my worldview, I have a truth anchor that I can compare for what is true and what is false. I have an anchor for morality. I have an anchor for laws of logic. All these things make sense and are explainable in reality because we start with the creator. It's for the universe, the methodological naturalists that will have trouble explaining where's the truth anchor. But I don't want to get lost because I've already repeated that.
I think it's fine not to know. I'm just having issues with assertions that I personally haven't seen good arguments for yet. I'm asking if you could present some sort of physical proof, or if you could direct me to it, if that's a better example. Because even places like I think it's the Templeton Foundation, can't even prove the power of prayer. So I'm a little hard pressed to agree with some of the arguments and apply it to my epistemology, if that makes any sense.
So as I said before, we're always going to interpret evidence according to our worldview. You're going to look at all evidence and interpret that evidence from
According
methodological naturalism, right?
according to your worldview, though, it would be extremely obvious to me that a God would exist, and I wouldn't have.
Well,
very many doubts.
my worldview also tells me that you will repress the truth. You will suppress it because you don't want there to be a God. So you'll suppress the truth that you see. Let me continue for just a second to explain the reason why it is a category error to expect that there is naturalistic evidence for the supernatural. Think of a video game character. And a video game character says, I know there is no game designer because he needs to show himself. If he can't show himself within this game, which he doesn't believe he's in a game, in his reality, within his reality, that if I can't see the game designer, then there is none. Everything just happened the way it is. There's no way that a game designer could show himself if he programs in something within the game to say, writing on the wall, there is a game designer. The character in the video game could say, look, see, the game even generates views that maybe there is a game designer, but we know there's not because he's not here. He's not doing what I say. So it's a category error there to expect there to be natural evidence of the supernatural.
As a counter to that, if I was the video game character and I prayed to the game designer and the designer did indeed respond, and he sent an exploding chest with a banner that says, yes, I exist, I would definitely accept that. You
would definitely explain it within the boundaries of that game, within your worldview. I'll give you an example. Jesus even said this in Luke 16. He talks about a man who had died and went to Abraham's bosom, and the other one went to hell, the rich man. And the rich man said, please send someone to my brothers. If you would just have someone rise from the dead, then they would know that there is a heaven and a hell, and they do not want to come here to this hell. And Jesus said, even if someone were to rise from the dead, they would not be convinced. They have Moses and the prophets. So Jesus says right there, they have the revelation from God. Evidence doesn't work. And the third thing is, you're going to interpret evidence according to your worldview. That's how it works. So we talk about dinosaur fossils. You're going to say it's billions of years old or millions of years old. And I'm going to say they were buried in the flood.
But where's the dead people rising up to warn us that weren't just shocked back to life in the hospital bed?
That's how you would interpret it. You would say that some natural cause forced that.
I'm pretty sure if somebody was dead for a day or two and they rose up, I'd be a little convinced of something there.
Well, Jesus did that. Jesus was dead for 3 days and rose again. Do you believe that Jesus was dead and rose again? And if not,
I would have to see contemporary Roman writers, and Paul doesn't count because he was obviously in on making the church a thing, and that was also mainly.
He was in on the conspiracy, the Jesus conspiracy.
I don't know if I call it conspiracy. It's more or less he was in the same book that claimed he was risen.
These disciples all died for that knowledge. Even when faced with persecution and death, they didn't recant and say, we're just kidding. They went to the grave with that claim, with those claims.
There's also full-on gun practitioners in China during the persecution who died over their beliefs too. I don't think that that's a really good metric of truth for that.
Well, you haven't given me any metric for truth, so I don't know how you can explain any metric for truth so far.
Oh, I believe the only things that we can consider to be true in a relative sense are things that we can demonstrate to be true.
So, and that goes back to this idea of empiricism. If you only can demonstrate something to be true, perhaps you could demonstrate something to be true. Could you demonstrate for me, please, Genghis Khan, that he lived and that he was a true person in history?
Well, there's more than one source. He doesn't just have one or two books around him. There are people.
No, science. I want you to scientifically demonstrate.
Probably the weapons would be a pretty good example.
That could be attributed to anybody.
Yeah, but that's a lot different than.
That doesn't demonstrate Genghis Khan to me. I want Genghis Khan. If you're going to totally reject all historical documents as non-empirical, then you can't even demonstrate anything prior to you being born.
Well, they've left weapons and armor and other things along their war path. I'm sure we could dig that up. I'm sure we have. We have not exhumed anything related to the resurrection, and we haven't seen anything like it since then. It's a little bit of a non sequitur there. We have the Bible, which kind of is used to confirm itself, writers that weren't contemporary trying to back it up hundreds of years later, and we have these other historical documents about Genghis Khan that are backed up from the loser's point of view a lot too. Now, not to say that everything in the Bible is false, I'm just not convinced that the miracles in it are true. And I don't know, it just seems a little wishy-washy with its predictions too. Like, I don't think that you can use a book to prove a book.
Well, from what I've heard, you haven't been able to prove anything.
If you want to use that metric for truth, then the what do they call it? The Bhagavad Gita, or however you pronounce that, would be true, because it's even older than the Bible. They have a Trinity as well. They have a bunch of stuff that was around since before Judaism or Christianity.
So I have another question. From the methodological naturalism point of view, we as humans are probably going to have about 80 years of life, give or take. Why would a person waste their time on social media or debates or any activity other than ensuring that one is producing and caring for as many healthy offspring as possible, or perhaps hedonism or nihilism? In other words, why are you here rather than doing something that your worldview would say is productive?
Oh, I am. I'm in college trying to become a scientist to better the human race over time. I plan on going for my PhD after this. And as for why I'm debating you, I'm just interested in hearing other people's worldviews, discussing mine, seeing where I'm wrong, seeing where other people are wrong. And I personally wouldn't mind having some good proof and evidence of the supernatural. So that's why I come on stuff like this occasionally.
So even though your worldview is centered on evolution being true and the propagation of your genetic code being of vital importance to the future, you would instead use some of your time on debating and social media rather than hedonism or protecting your offspring?
Why not? Seems like the thing to do. Discussion of ideas is one way that we can, we can improve our knowledge one way or another. You know what I mean? Like, there's not much else I can do as a student, especially since school doesn't really start till next Tuesday.
Okay, but ultimately, what is the ultimate purpose of you being born and dying in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years after you're dead? What will you leave behind that is of value to the universe, that is bound for an ultimate heat death?
Oh, I don't think anything would matter truly in that sense, but I do think that things matter in the sense that we ascribe meaning to them. So I think that if I can somehow improve our understanding of the universe, even if it's only by making a single equation, then I would have done something good for humanity.
You talk about wanting to do good for humanity. Why is humanity valuable and worth having good things done for it?
I ascribe value to them, and if we're being completely honest, what I'm doing is mostly out of interest. Like, I do want humanity to know more, but in the end, it's more of a personal journey to me.
But you don't necessarily have that. Do you think humanity has intrinsic value?
In the sense that we ascribe value to humanity, yeah.
Except for those who don't, like Joseph Stalin or Hitler, so who's to say they were right or wrong?
Well, in an objective sense, if you're talking about the entire universe, which is too big to really consider anything if it did indeed have a consciousness, in the grand scheme of things, yeah, I guess you could say that didn't matter. But on a personal level, he did a lot to destroy as many people as he could. So I'd say that that's pretty bad for the gene pool overall. if everybody was like him, we would simply not be here to have this conversation. So I would say that the question itself kind of disproves itself, if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. But if it was the gene pool, what is worthy of saving? You talked about since Hitler killed a lot of people, or Stalin killed a lot of people, that he thinned the gene pool, and that was a bad thing, because is it the gene pool that is ultimately worthy of worship and protection, value?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's worship. I mean, say this, if there was more people like Joseph Stalin, we simply wouldn't have a gene pool to worry about. And I'm pretty sure that we as a society want to live, because that's how we kind of came about. So we obviously can't support people like Hitler or Stalin, because that's kind of counterproductive to us.
So you're a pragmatist now. How are we doing on time, Joseph?
Huh?
I'm sorry, Joseph. James, how are we doing on time, James?
We're doing well. We got about 7 minutes until we go to Q&A. So I just let people know that we're on the final 2 minutes of Q&A intake. So
Hello?
yeah, I'd say
Very good.
maybe another 5 minutes if you guys are good for that.
Yeah, I'll do a couple more.
Okay. How about this question? Does symbiosis make more sense from a naturalist perspective, or the perspective that God designed creatures, plants, and bacteria to interact, and why?
What would you describe as symbiosis? I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but how would you describe that?
So, for instance, the vanilla flower and the specific vanilla bee that is the only bee that can pollinate that flower. Does it make more sense, assuming that they could not survive without one or the other? They would have had to have evolved in parallel, or that God designed them to interact?
That makes more sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Why?
Because if you evolve, if that bee evolved that way and that flower evolved that way, then it's just the way it happened, if that makes any sense. Like,
Doesn't.
it didn't have, there was nothing in mind when that happened. It just kind of went that way. Like, how does the bee like pollinate it and move around its, I'm not really much of a biologist, if you didn't know.
I'm not either. I'm just trying to ascribe. We look at reality and we see things interact that are totally unrelated, and yet are reliant upon each other.
They're undoubtedly related. Obviously, the bee evolved to do something that was beneficial to the flower, and the flower was obviously beneficial to the bee. And along the lines, they must have just developed in such a way that they helped each other survive. They probably evolved from common ancestors that didn't even have anything to do with each other at one point, though. I'm pretty sure a phenologist would give you a much more satisfactory answer than that, though.
But again, that is just conjecture. Totally conjecture of, well, since it's there, it must have happened this way.
Then how do you explain that we have a lot of fossils that are indicative of a common ancestor for just about every animal that we have around?
How do I explain fossils? I explain fossils from the flood. The flood is...
Okay, so how is a flood possible when we have stuff like the geologic column? The
flood created the geologic column. God revealed it.
Do you think that's how minerals act when they have a lot of water over them? Because they would have been able to account for that in geology.
They're going to interpret the evidence according to their worldview. We know that there was a worldwide flood because that's what God revealed.
Well, then you would find a lot more, I would imagine you would find a lot more salt deposits or something there from all the water that came down. I'm not a geologist, so.
I'm not either, but everything we find is perfectly in line with what God has revealed.
Yeah, but you would have to prove it a lot more than that, because we have evidence of trees that were even alive during the supposed flood, and a lot of prominent.
There are a lot of assumptions built into those age dates.
No, there's no assumptions in that.
So someone was born 5,000 years ago and was able to track the birth of and the whole life of that tree.
You do realize that there are entire fields of study dedicated to that there's people that all they do is look at pieces of wood and figure out the dates and the little minute differences between what they call false rings and things like that. I'm definitely willing to trust people who spend their entire lives doing nothing but study tree rings. So that's some dedication right there for something that isn't true.
So you have great faith in naturalists.
Well, it's not really faith when they can make valid predictions.
Have they ever made a false prediction?
Probably not by much when it comes to radiometric dating and tree ring dating, because those aren't really things that are subject to human error as much as, I mean, there's always a small error bar, but no, not really. And it's kind of...
We're just to let you know, we got about a 1-minute warning, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
But yeah, the fossil record also can't be explained by the flood, because fossils tend to take a while to fossilize, for one thing, and for two, you can radiometrically date some of the rocks around different fossils to different dates that are dramatically different. It's not even a small percent error in that case. So I'm not really...
I encourage you to read the book that I'll send to you later, The Bones of Contention. He talks a lot about the way that radiometric dating works and the assumptions that are built into it.
No, I'm going to tell you, there's no assumptions with radiometric dating, because
well, there are, but I've studied it. There are a lot of assumptions.
That would make cosmology almost impossible, not just geology, because radiation, as you stated in your opening statement, is relatively constant. And radioactive decay is relatively constant too. So I'm not really seeing any assumption here.
Well, there are assumptions. I don't know if we're going to have time to it, because he gave us the 1-minute bell, but maybe we can cover it in one of the questions. Maybe someone can ask a question, and I'll go over the assumptions involved in radiometric dating.
Sounds good.
So we will move into the Q&A, and thanks for your guys' patience. So very excited to go into this section, as a lot of people have got great questions. So with that, Lucifer Almighty asks first. This is a question. It's his title. I'm not calling him Satan as an insult. He says, how can he know God is, he's asking the theist, Matt in this case, how can he know that God is his foundation when he uses his senses for that without begging the question?
That's a good question. God revealed himself. I don't know how God did it, but God has revealed himself such that I can know things for certain.
You got it. Thank you very much for the question and for the answer. So next, Lucifer Almighty, again, not insulting him, self-titled, he asks, why deny common ancestry when Christian scientists have helped demonstrate it and they have no problem with it?
Well, one of the things I started out with is I'm not here to represent any particular denomination. Perhaps some Christian who felt the need to help with that did that work, but because I know that God revealed himself through Scripture, when he revealed that he did not create via a common ancestor, we know that anything that is different than that is thereby false. He revealed that he created according to their kind, and the kinds reproduce without crossing those barriers. So because that's what God revealed, we know that is true.
You got it. Thank you very much for that question, and for, again, Matt, your answer. We have, so if you happen to have a question for Joseph, we have a disproportionate amount of questions for Matt, which is good. We're happy to ask Matt questions. However, just so Joseph gets questions as well, if you guys want, I will reopen the Q&A intake for a few minutes if you have questions for Joseph in particular. And otherwise, we will just keep going for the questions for Matthew. Bud Askins asks, please ask both of the guests. Okay, so this is a great opportunity for both. Their views on whether or not of the 108 billion humans believed to have existed are born atheists. So I think he's asking, what are your views regarding the idea that out of the roughly 108 billion humans that have lived on the planet in Earth's history, what are your thoughts on the idea that they were born atheists?
Joseph, you want to go first?
Oh, yeah. This is an interesting question. I think from just the perspective of not really knowing anything, they could be atheists. I don't think that they would be able to hold a positive position of atheism, but certainly a negative one. So I would say it would be fair to say that everyone is born atheist, just like they're born a Democrat or a Republican. They don't really have the neural connections to understand a concept of a God, let alone proclaim a belief in one. So just for simplicity's sake, I would say yes, people probably are, for the most part, born atheists.
You got it. How about you, Matt?
Well, I have to give credit to this answer to a man named Seiton Bruggencate. I am an atheist. I do not believe in atheists. If someone claims to be an atheist, it is because they suppress the truth. And in Romans 1, it tells us that since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been seen, being clearly understood from what has been made, so that man is without excuse. So I don't believe there's never been an atheist born. What matters is their rebellion against the Creator. Even Satan, as the one guy who asked the question earlier, Lucifer, he knows that God exists. He's seen all the evidence. All the evidence in the world will not convince him to repent of his rebellion and humble himself before God. So this is a confirmation of what I was talking about earlier. Even Lucifer, who has been in the presence of Almighty God, will not humble himself and repent of his sin. And even if he did, he couldn't redeem his rebellion anyway. But it goes to show that humans who keep wanting all this evidence, the fallen angels and Satan, they've seen the evidence. It's not enough. People will suppress the truth in their rebellion.
You bet.
I know we're doing Q&A, but can I ask one question to him about that? Because something struck me as odd about his statement.
I mean, if you really want, but it will mean that we won't have quite as many questions from the audience, just because we do have
fair enough.
just only because it's a double header. I got to keep it.
Okay. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
No problem. Totally okay. So Z Wonder asks, for the agnostic, so for Joseph, where does the information or code come from, or code come from that is needed to create all of the material world? Thanks.
I think a pretty good answer to that is simply I don't know. We've got some pretty good ideas about the nature of the universe, how it could maybe, how you say, create matter from nothing, and we think it does all the time, at least with virtual particles. I probably will be more equipped to answer this question when I'm closer to graduation, if that makes any sense. So for now, I think a fair and honest answer would be I don't know completely for sure.
You got it. Next we have Lucifer Almighty asking, question for Matt, the theist. Why is the consensus of biblical scholars that Roman 1 was for the Pharisees and not everyone?
I don't know when the last time it was that I got exegesis and Bible study information from someone who claims to be an atheist. So I would take, I don't believe that there is a consensus that Romans 1 was specifically to the Pharisees. Being that it was Rome, I think he's got his facts wrong. This was written to the Romans, and the Pharisees were in Jerusalem. So there's a start, but taking Bible history or exegesis from someone who claims with the name Lucifer would be shallow at best.
You got it. So we got the next question coming in from Z Wonder and Z Yonder. Sorry about that. So they ask, for the agnostic, so for Joseph, what use would naturalistic evolution have for consciousness? Why not make humans the same way that other creatures are made?
I think, I don't mean to sound rude, but I think the question in itself is flawed. I don't think evolution intended for anything to happen. I think the way we developed just so happened to be in such a way that it was beneficial. So as you can see, we're obviously pretty good at multiplying and building conditions in which we can survive. So we just ended up being really good at surviving and passed on our genes. That's the best I can really answer that with. And as we passed on our genes, we got smarter and smarter because it was beneficial.
You got it. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Next is Karag Nightwolf asks, how can you be intellectually honest on how you evaluate evidence when one of your axioms is that God exists and the Bible is true, and that any evidence to the contrary is false? So my guess is that is for Matt.
So I would first ask him, how does he account for honesty? If you don't have a truth anchor to know what is true and what is false, how can you ascribe to me dishonesty or honesty? So his question is invalid because he doesn't have a truth anchor, which I have a truth anchor. Since God is the self-existent creator of the universe, I can judge things as honest or dishonest, true or false. So because of his revelation, we know that all evidence affirms that.
You got it. Thank you very much. Next we have Lucifer Almighty. Question for Matt. Why do Christian scientists use methodological naturalism when doing science? And then he says, I think he's confusing methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism.
In practice, those two philosophies are essentially the same. Methodological naturalism is how we conduct and do science. Well, you'd have to ask some of the greatest scientists of all time who were young Earth creationists. Sir Isaac Newton, I could bring up a list of them, but all these men thought it was important that God was the creator and founder of life, and that he revealed himself through scripture and through his son, such that science was necessary and that science was even possible. So yeah, I'd probably be better to ask Sir Isaac Newton.
You got it. Thank you very much. So next is For a Love Of asks, my question is for the Christian. Do the billions of unelect have intrinsic value?
Yes.
You got it. Next, John Peterson asks, would you please ask the theist if he knows what a straw man is? So these are the types of questions where it's like, I mean, it's not really a question as much as a statement. And I would defend Joseph on this too. So if somebody asked Joseph, like, Joseph, do you know what a non sequitur is? I would be like, that's like not like it doesn't seem to be an authentic question. So
it's fair. I don't mind answering that question. And I think it was pretty clear in the opening that I asked Joseph to interrupt me anytime that I misrepresented him. And I hope I have not misrepresented anything that Joseph has said or believed. If I did, Joseph, I apologize, and let's talk about it. Perhaps you can help me to understand better where there was a straw man brought up. If there was one, I don't think there was one. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's the kind of question I'd prefer. Is maybe if somebody just said like, "Hey, so and so, does this worldview that you talked about really teach what you said X, or do you think this is a straw man?" That way, at least you're getting at like the actual issue, so we can talk about it. But let's see. For a Love Of asked a question. We got his question already. And then Let's Do It asked, question for the Christian. Do you think there is an objective purpose in life, and can you demonstrate its objectivity?
Yes, there is an objective purpose in life, and it is to honor God. God revealed it all throughout His Word to honor Him. That is the purpose of mankind, to honor Him. And when we try to fill that void, that purpose, with something other than that purpose, it is ultimately unsatisfactory. And we see that all over as evidence of people trying to fill their lives with things that are unsatisfactory. And it ruins lives rather than trying to do their best to praise and honor the Creator.
You got it. Thank you very much. And so next, McGhostLovin asked, how could one maintain a 6,000 to 10,000 year old Earth when the gene pool can demonstrably prove that to be an impossibility? You don't share a common ancestor in that timeline.
I would point out the plethora of assumptions built into the demonstrable case, because the universal common ancestor was not preserved through time. The fossil record is a clear picture of sudden and abrupt appearance in the fossil record and stasis throughout. So his claim that there is evidence, demonstrable evidence, of a single common ancestor through time, he either has rejected or is unaware of the assumptions built into the billions of years, millions of years, however, whatever he had said earlier. So check your assumptions.
Excellent question and excellent answer. So we appreciate all of the answers. You guys are very articulate. I can say that even if nobody agrees with you, I think you would hopefully give credit to the debaters, because I think that they are both clear in what they're trying to communicate. You might not agree with it. You might say, hey, I don't buy the evidence, but I can at least say good job on being clear. So hopefully we, and I think the debaters did well at showing each other respect, which is exactly what we're going for. So we appreciate that. And for the biggest thing is, I want to say thank you to the debaters. They got into the hot seat. They did the preparation, like they hit the books so that they could articulate their ideas. So thank you very much for coming on, you guys.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, my pleasure. And so hopefully we're good to have you back. And if you'd like to see them another time, please let us know. Shoot a comment, as I'd certainly enjoy it, and I'm confident you would too. We've also got another debate starting up in about 5 minutes, linked in the description. That's on whether or not morality is relative. So that debate is going to be starting up with Chris and Cerebral Faith, and that'll be in just a few minutes and is linked in the top of the description box. So for the questions, thank you so much for your questions, everybody. Totally appreciate your engagement, and thanks for your patience as we had that technical start. I honestly don't know what it is. I kind of think my computer may be possessed or something. It's crazy. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm working on figuring that out. And we're going to use Google Chats for the next one, so we don't have, it's like 40 minutes. Anyway, we'll be all right. Okay, so thanks again for the debaters for their patience and grace during that.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Joseph. Appreciate the opportunity.
Oh yeah, thanks for coming on to debate me and clarify the problems we were having in the Twitter chat.
Yeah, well, excellent. Enjoyed it, guys. I hope you all have a great night and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care.
God bless.